Hello Internet, my name is Alex. I release music under my alias Project AER, and my new album is out. It's called Motions, it's out now, it's a completely independent thing, and one thing that I thought would be really fun to do for each of the tracks, which is a lot of work, but I thought it'd be fun, is to break down each track and kind of go through the project files for each track and just kind of detail like how I made some of these songs and kind of what went into them. So we're going to do these day by day, we're going to do these in order, and the first track that we're going to do is the first track on Motions, which is called Lark. So this is the project file for Lark. It's not a very complicated song, there's not a lot of elements to this song at all. It's very loop based, it's very simplistic, and quite a few of these songs are, and around this time I was writing songs for like in a massive batch that kind of ended up being for a few different projects, but one of which obviously being my album. So Lark was actually written quite late on in the process, and it was quite a quick track to kind of come together, but I think it all kind of centered around the piano part that I wrote in the intro, which kind of formed really the backbone for the entire song. So what we'll do is we'll kind of go through all the elements bit by bit. We'll kind of go through the intro and break down all the elements there, and then kind of go through all the different sections. And there's not a lot of sections here. We have an intro, which is kind of this first section here, then which is quite long for an intro for me. I mean, that takes us up to about 36 seconds. And we have a beat section here with the kind of yellow drums here. We have a little breakdown, which is only, 4 bars long. And then we have another beat section, which is a little bit longer than the last one, with some alternations at the end. And then we have an outro just at the end here. So going through the intro, there's only really a few elements here to kind of look at. One is the piano, which is, as I said, kind of formed the backbone of the entire song, which is this piano part here. For that, I just used the Lab soft piano from Spitfire Audio. It's a free piano, and I'm sure everyone knows about it at this point, but if you don't, it is the best free piano I think that there probably is out there. I'm sure there's other great free pianos, but this is fantastic and something I was using a lot around this time. The MIDI for this is, as you see here, it was all played in. I don't think there's actually any quantizing going on here at all. So I played this in on my little kind of M Audio Keystation 32 here, and then just recorded it. So there are no kind of edits to that. You can see here that nothing is kind of perfectly quantized. You have this sort of rolled chord at the beginning here. Some bits are in time, which will be an accident, will not be something I've done on purpose. But as you can see, because of what I really like about playing parts in on a keyboard, or even kind of using the humanize function on something, is you get that kind of, it makes MIDI sound so much more real, especially when you're kind of getting a more emotive performance like this. But I think that was probably the element that I spent the most time on, because it really kind of added the most to the song. I mean, it is the song, really. I think without that piano part, the song would be very boring. Other elements that you have in the intro, we have 2 samples that run throughout the entire song. One is this birdsong sample, which is something I just recorded on my phone. Let's turn it up a bit. And that just, I mean, it's birdsong. It was a mono sample because I recorded it on my phone, just using like a wave recorder on my phone. There's a bit of EQ on there just to kind of EQ out some of the lows. Just as you can see, there's a lot of low end rumble, so it just cleans up that low end. If I was being smarter at the time, I probably would have just ducked the highs a tiny bit as well, just to make sure that some of those birdsong songs aren't too kind of resonant. I'm then using Ozone Imager, which is a free imager from iZotope, which is amazing because it allows you to take mono samples and stereoize them in a way to kind of make a mono sample stereo. And obviously it's not perfect, you're not going to get a perfect stereo sample out of it, but I just think it adds a little bit more kind of flavor to something. So without the stereoize, what you can actually see on the graph here is it becomes a purely mono signal. And once we add it in, it starts to spread that information a little bit. I think if you do too much, it starts to sound a little bit unnatural and you start getting like phasing issues. But just leaving this on the default of 6 and then just getting the width somewhere between sort of 15 and 25% in the positive usually sounds really nice to me. It's a great way to take phone samples and just make them sound better, really. The other element that we have in the intro is this ambient piano, which is on a lot of my songs from around this time. It's on a lot of my songs on my album Growth Patterns, and it's also pretty much all over Motions as well, which is this ambient piano here. So I can probably make a whole video kind of detailing that technique overall and in terms of how I make that. There are a few different ways to do it. One is using Native Instruments Noir and using what's called its particles engine. And what I actually used for this song, and I think most of the songs on Motions, is I used a piano sample where I kind of, using a piano of my choice, and you can do this with any instrument, I played kind of Cs across 3 or 4 octaves, so just kind of spaced them out randomly. Wasn't, you can play with different sort of timings. Loaded that as a noise sample in Serum, and that effectively, because it's the Cs and you set it to key track, it starts to move the notes around and creates this sort of randomized stuff. And because it's speeding up and slowing down the sample, the space between notes gets shorter and longer because you're changing the speed of the sample to kind of to manipulate the pitch. I could do a whole video on that technique. It's not unique to me. It's not something that I came up with. It's something that I pretty shamelessly stole from the 1975. It is all over their kind of last couple of albums. I think you can hear it most prominently on tracks like the self-titled track off their last album, Love Theme off of A Brief Inquiry, and various other songs of theirs. But it's just something I heard about from them and fell in love with the idea and wanted to just use it all over my tracks very unashamedly. On that, you can obviously hear that there was some reverb on it. I will have done some effects before I kind of bounced it out to audio, because beforehand it's just MIDI. And then to kind of get that sort of reverby sort of character to it, I will have just put some effects on there. I could probably do a whole video on this one technique. So if you want that, leave a comment or something, and maybe I'll do a whole video on that as well. Then we just have a bit of EQ, just again, cutting out the low end, just kind of, to clear the room out there for, the drums and the bass. And then just kind of ducking around the sort of, what's that, around 1.2 kilohertz? 1.36 kilohertz. We're kind of ducking it a little bit there. And then there's just, again, a little bit of ozone imaging. Don't need to stereoize it because it's not a mono sample. It looks like I haven't actually done anything to it though, so probably wasn't meant to be there. Maybe I was just looking at the stereo image. I didn't touch on the piano, just a little bit of EQ on the piano. It's not doing huge amounts to it. So you can see I've left a lot of the low end information in there for the intro. What I've actually done though is added a bit of automation to it, so that once we get to the beat section where the bass comes in, that low end information gets scooped out, because otherwise it'd be competing with the bass. It's quite a good thing to do, I think, if you have something like a piano, which is a very natural and full sounding instrument that takes up the whole frequency range, to think about the sections where, if the piano is going to be kind of holding its own, don't just apply like a sort of low cut or high pass EQ to it and leave it on throughout the whole song. Maybe think about automating it in kind of where you want it. So you can see in the end here, I've brought some of that low end information back, and then it kind of gets scooped out again to kind of take it even higher and kind of make it sound a bit more like, I don't know, like a bad speaker sort of effect, I guess. We'll look at that when we look at the intro. Also in the intro, there is just some filtered drums, which what I do here is I tend to just kind of highlight my drum section, mix it down, and just export the drums on their own, which does that and gets me, you can see it's the same color there. And then I just usually put an EQ on it to kind of like telephone it a little bit. If you're wondering why the lighting or anything has just changed, it's because my recording thing decided to stop recording the audio from Studio One, so it was just me talking to myself. So this is me trying to pick up from where I left off and just carry on talking about it from there. So without this EQ, it would just be a normal sounding drum track, just without the kick. So you can see that it's just cutting out that information. It's also going to the reverb mix as well, so you'll hear it in the reverb. There you go. Then as we move towards the transition into the first sort of drop, as it were, we have a few samples here that are kind of creating that sort of transition. First up, we have a reverse glass smash sample. Let's play everything together first, shall we? So we have a snare with delay, we have a glass smash sample, a reverse sort of tambourine smash, which is from a sample pack, and 2 reversed percussion samples. And that's that. So there's kind of 2 kind of parts to that. This sort of sweeping into the snare and then sweeping into the actual kind of drop as such. So first we have this reversed glass smash sample. and that's just got some EQ to cut out all of the lows and just to cut some of the highs because it's a very harsh sounding sample. And then we have this, which is again cut to the highs. It's mixed a little bit lower because it's quite a higher sort of sample, so I don't want this to become one of those things that sounds horrible to your ears. And there you go. Then we have the snare, which is just the snare from the song on its own track with a 16th note delay, which is just mixed in. And then we have these reversed percussion samples, which just kind of act as sweeps. So you have one here that's got a delay on it, which is a quarter note delay, which I like doing on reversed things or sweeps because it helps kind of keep the transition going and keep a bit of consistency between the sort of bridge that you're building between these two sections of the song. And then we have this other one here. So that kind of helps build all the transition between those two sections. Then as we go into the first drop, we have the drums. So we have a kick, which just has a little bit of EQ just to cut out the super low frequencies. And we have a snare, which has an EQ on it, just to cut out again some of the lows, because I mean, when we take away the low cut, that's low end information that we don't really need, that's just going to be muddying up our mix. And then we have an ozone imager, which is stereoizing here as well, because this is actually a mono drum sample. So stereoizing that just helps make it a bit more stereo and just gives us a bit more information to work with. Then we have a bunch of Foley samples that are kind of lined up to add a bit of texture to the song, which are, again, EQ'd. They've got a sidechain, so they're being sidechained to the kick. I'll talk about my sidechain in just a moment. And then we have a hi-hat as well, which is on every 8th note except the except the 2nd and 4th quarter note. Basically wherever the snare hits, the hi-hat isn't there, just to help create a bit of room for the snare. And then that's EQ to just the super high frequencies to keep it nice and bright, and then there's just a bit of ozone imager on that to widen it a little bit as well. The drums then altogether sound like this. Really simple. I'm using Supercharger GT for bus compression on my drums. I use this on pretty much every drum bus that I have on every track. It's actually in my template. One of the reasons I really like Supercharger GT is because it has automatic makeup gain, so you just use this input trim here, and as long as you're mostly in the green and not in the over red arrow, it will kind of automatically adjust your makeup gain. So it's one less thing for me to think about. It's probably not as accurate as if I did it on my own, but I just like how it sounds. And what I'm doing here is what's called parallel compression, where I've got a very heavily compressed signal, because I'm doing quite a lot of compression to this, but I'm actually mixing it in. So there's a wet and a dry signal here that I'm playing with, and it's on a 50-50 sort of mix. So if I turn that to completely 100% wet, you just hear the compressed signal. And you can hear that's like, it's a lot more punchy, it's quite a lot more aggressive, and it's just not what I really want for the song. So actually mixing it in with the dry signal, because the dry signal on its own sounds a bit naff. So obviously it's a little bit quieter, so it won't sound quite as good to your ears. But when we mix them in and we get kind of this like blend of the two sounds, it just sounds a bit sweeter, helps sort of glue all the drums together. Then we have the bass guitar part, which is super simple. It's just root notes following the chords. And this is just my bass guitar, which is a Fender Squier Jaguar bass, which is a super cheap bass, just a really, really nice bass. I've had it for years now. Just going through Guitar 85 in a clean bass preset, which I don't think I've tweaked. I'm using Pro Q2 in mid-side mode to cut some of the low-end information out of the side channels, just because bass in the low end should be mono, otherwise you're going to risk phase issues. This is normally something I do at the mastering stage, but I find it can be quite helpful sometimes just to do it while I'm mixing, just to kind of make sure I'm not getting any issues. Then there's a bit of EQ just to warm it up in the low end a little bit, and I've cut out some of the highs to kind of reduce string noise, which some songs I might want that, some songs I might not want that, but in this case, yeah, I wanted to keep that high end nice and clean. And then I'm compressing a little bit with CLA 76, which is a Waves emulation of, I think, in the 1176, I can't remember the actual brand name of the compressor, but it's a very famous compressor, and I should know, but it just sounds great on everything, but it sounds great on bass. I'm being quite aggressive with that as well. I'm doing about 5 dB of gain reduction in places, so about 3 to 5. You can hear my bass part there is really, really simple. The piano continues from before. We have this guitar part that comes in, which is just following the chords once again. Really nice and simple for this first part. And that is just Guitar Rig 5 using a Clean Cave preset, which sometimes I might tweak, but I mean, it's 90% of the Project Air sound right there. Sometimes I tweak it, sometimes it just doesn't really need it. It's a very great sounding preset. It's also in Guitar Rig 6 if you do have that. And then just a bit of EQ to cut out some of the lows and some of the highs. And then again, a little bit more compression with CLA 76. Just sounds really nice. To talk about sidechains for a moment, I have different sidechain channels set up for, like my guitars, what I call chords, which is basically everything that's not guitars or bass. I have a bass channel, and then I have a sidechain on my reverb channel. I use Vengeance Producer Suite multiband sidechain for my sidechaining. The reason why I like to use this over like sidechain compression is this isn't compressing the signal. This is just volume shaping, which I can use a direct sidechaining from my kick, which is what I'm using. You can also use MIDI, or you can just sync it to every quarter note, eighth note. If you're making like EDM, it's a really great way to just drag and drop in a sidechain. It's very cool, and you can just control this curve here. I don't ever really use the multiband side of it, and you can change the time base, so the time base that the curve is happening over, so you can slow it down or speed it up, things like that. It's a really clever plugin, probably a little bit overkill, and you can achieve the same sort of result from like Cable Guy's Volume Shaper, Kickstart, and stuff like that. There's a lot, and I think even LFO Tool could do it as well. But that's what I use for pretty much all my side chains. I just think it sounds a bit cleaner than using compression, but maybe that's just me being pedantic. We then have two more guitar parts that come in the second half of the first drop. One is this little eighth note part here. Which is just Clean Cave preset, but again with a little bit of EQ on it, panned off ever so slightly to the left. And there's this super high guitar part here. This is a Clean Cave preset which is being run into Valhalla Shimmer, being EQ'd after it just to clean up the lows, panned off to the right. I've actually transposed this part up an octave. So if we transpose it down, it still sounds nice, but it doesn't sound quite as high and dreamy. It still sounds pretty dreamy. If we remove the shimmer though, you can actually hear what this part was originally, which I think is not a great part for the song, but actually by transposing it up an octave, so 12 semitones there, it starts to sound quite cool because it has this unnatural sort of sound to it. And then once we add the shimmer, it becomes this pad that just, yeah, you wouldn't have known. What I like doing when I'm writing songs is recording more guitar parts than I'm going to use, or just more parts than I'm going to use, because I think obviously the first part of writing is constructive, but then the second part is kind of destructive and kind of seeing what you don't need and what you can sort of repurpose. And there'll be parts like that where I've recorded it, not really liked it, but instead of kind of throwing it away, I've gone, okay, well, what can I do? What if I pitch shifted it up or down and then reverbed it and turned it into a pad? So it's finding creative ways to kind of use that. And the more you record to begin with, the more you kind of give yourself to work with when you come back to that. We then get to the bridge where the filtered drums come back, the same transition from earlier takes place, but we also start to hear this shimmery guitar lead, which is my favourite part of the whole song. I absolutely love that guitar part. It's just, yeah, same sort of thing. It's just played in, it's not pitched or anything, and it's just using Valhalla Shimmer once again. And it's, in the actual drop, it sounds like this. But yeah, that's pretty much that. We start to add a little bit more information into the drums here. We add these two extra loops that come into play. So one sounds like this, which is heavily EQ'd because I think that loop actually has a kick in it. Yeah, there you go. So now it becomes more like a sort of textural, sort of additive thing that I'm adding to the drums. It's quite handy if you have these like drum loops that have a kick in them, or just have like a lot of low end information. Just find ways to do a bunch of EQ to them to layer them with other percussion loops or kind of other percussion that you've already laid out, and it just finds ways to. It helps you find ways to make things more textural and a bit more kind of just add a bit more depth to it, Then we have a Foley loop which sounds like this. again EQ'd, but cutting out some of the highs there as well. And those two together sound like this. And then the drums all together from this point sound like this. Just adds a tiny bit more depth to the drums in this part. And that bit kind of just loops a couple of times. And then we have a little bit here where we have these two samples. Like a little crunch sample and then an open hi-hat, which are nice and subtle. It just gives us something to kind of break the kind of loop at that point. And that is pretty much that. The piano then obviously starts to change a little bit. And we go up an octave, and that's when the low frequency starts to scoop out that extra information at the end again. But yeah, that is pretty much the first track from Motions, that is Lark Rise. This is like my third time trying to record this because it kept cutting out the audio, so we're going to see if this has worked. Yeah, for the next few days we're going to be doing each track day by day from Motions and just breaking these down and kind of going into a bit of detail about how these are made and just looking at the stems in the project files. If there's anything here you want me to elaborate on, make a whole video about, potentially like some production techniques or like plugins, do just let me know, leave a comment or something. If this was helpful, please leave a like or a comment or subscribe or something, because all those things help, you know, with algorithms and stuff. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next video, which is going to be track 2, which is the track called Gone from Motions. So I'll see you then. Thank you and goodbye.